Admiral Sarah Chen stood at the observation deck of the UES Prometheus, watching the last human transport convoy disappear into hyperspace. Behind them lay the Centauri Gateway Station, humanity's first and most prestigious outpost in Council space. In 6 hours, alien security forces would board the station and strip it of every human trace, as they had done to 47 other installations across the galaxy over the past 3 months.
Admiral, incoming transmission from Earth Command, Lieutenant Rodriguez announced from the bridge comm station.
Sarah turned away from the viewport, her reflection briefly overlaying the distant stars. At 52, she had spent more of her life among alien species than her own kind. The silver threads in her dark hair had been earned negotiating peace treaties with the Vorthan Empire and coordinating joint operations against the Shriekers of Kepler. 442. Now, all of that diplomatic goodwill had evaporated like morning mist. "Put it through to my ready room," she said, walking briskly through the corridor lined with commendations from a dozen different alien governments. Soon, these awards would be as meaningless as pressed flowers. Fleet Admiral Marcus Webb's weathered face filled the holographic display, transmission lag creating a 3-second delay that made conversation feel like an awkward dance. Behind him, Sarah could see the familiar bustle of Earth's orbital defense platform. But something was different in Webb's eyes. The man who had led humanity's expansion into Council space looked older, more tired than she had ever seen him. "Sarah, what's the status on Operation Exodus?" Webb's voice carried the weight of 3 centuries of human achievement being systematically dismantled. "The last civilian transports cleared Council space 12 minutes ago," Sarah reported, checking her tablet. "Military evacuation is 80 to 7% complete. We'll have all personnel and equipment out within 48 hours as demanded." Webb nodded grimly. "And the restricted assets?" Sarah's expression darkened. The restricted assets were technologies that humanity had developed during their time in Council space, innovations that had made them indispensable, until the Council decided they were too dangerous to keep around. Quantum tunnel networks that could move fleets across the galaxy in hours instead of weeks. Predictive algorithms that could forecast and prevent conflicts before they started. Most importantly, the Aegis Defense Grid, an early warning system that monitored the dark spaces between galaxies for threats that made even the Council's ancient enemies look like schoolyard bullies. "The Council specifically demanded we leave all defensive infrastructure intact," Sarah said carefully, knowing their communications were likely being monitored. "They want to maintain operational security during the transition." What she didn't say, but Webb understood, was that humanity had spent decades building systems the other species couldn't operate. The Aegis grid alone required human neural patterns to function, its quantum processors calibrated specifically to human brain chemistry. Without human operators, it was just an expensive collection of dead circuits. "Admiral," came another voice over the comm. This one belonging to Dr. Fizuccio. Elena Vasquez, humanity's chief xenotechnologist. Her transmission originated from the research vessel Newton, currently stripping sensitive data from the Kepler research station. "We have a problem with the evacuation timeline." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Any delay now could give the Council an excuse to declare humanity in violation of the exile decree, potentially sparking the war that both sides were desperately trying to avoid. "What's the nature of the problem, Doctor?" "We've discovered something in the Deep Space Monitoring Array, something that wasn't in any of our previous reports." Elena's voice carried the particular tension of a scientist who had found something she wished she could unknow. "The Aegis sensors have been tracking movement in the void sectors for the past 6 months. Massive energy signatures unlike anything in our databases. The void sectors were the empty spaces between spiral arms, regions so devoid of matter that even light struggled to cross them. Ancient Council records spoke of things that dwelt in those spaces, entities so alien and hostile that even mentioning them was considered taboo among most species." "How massive are we talking?" Webb asked, his face growing pale despite the holographic distortion. "Signatures consistent with structures the size of small moons, Admiral. Multiple contacts moving in coordinated patterns toward inhabited systems. Whatever they are, they're not natural phenomena, and they're not any known species." Sarah felt the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. During her decades of service, she had heard whispered stories from older Council races about the things that lived between galaxies, entities that viewed entire civilizations as barely worthy of notice, that consumed stars for sustenance and turned inhabited worlds into breeding grounds for incomprehensible offspring. "Doctor, are you certain about these readings?" Sarah asked, hoping against hope that this was some kind of equipment malfunction.
I've run diagnostics 17 times, Admiral.
The readings are accurate. These entities have been approaching inhabited space since shortly after the Council issued humanity's exile decree. It's as if our withdrawal was some kind of signal. Webb leaned forward, his expression growing more troubled. How long before they reach inhabited systems? Based on current trajectory and speed, approximately 6 months until they reach the outer colonies, maybe 8 months before they threaten core Council worlds. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. For 3 centuries, humanity had maintained the Aegis defense grid, watching the dark spaces between stars for exactly this kind of threat. The Council had grown complacent, believing that their ancient enemies were long extinct or contained. They had forgotten that the universe contained horrors far worse than territorial disputes or trade wars. Admiral, Dr. Vasquez continued, there's something else. The entities appear to be following specific routes, avoiding certain systems while targeting others. It's almost like they have intelligence about current political situations, as if they've been watching and waiting for the right moment to move. Sarah's blood ran cold. You're suggesting they know about the exile. I'm suggesting they've been waiting for humanity to be removed from the equation. Every target they're approaching was previously protected by human-operated defense platforms or patrol routes. Webb's face had gone from pale to ashen. Doctor, prepare a full report on these findings. Sarah, we need to inform the Council immediately. Sir, Sarah said carefully, need I remind you that we are currently persona non grata? The Council made it very clear that any attempt to re-enter their space or contact their representatives would be considered an act of aggression. This transcends politics, Admiral. We're talking about a threat to every living being in the galaxy. Sarah wanted to believe that the Council would listen to reason, but she had witnessed firsthand the arrogance and xenophobia that had led to humanity's exile. The decision hadn't been based on any specific incident or legitimate grievance. Instead, it had grown from centuries of accumulated resentment from species who couldn't accept that the relative newcomers from Sol had become the galaxy's most effective problem solvers. The Vorthan Empire, with their massive fleets and warrior culture, resented taking orders from humans during joint military operations. The Crystalline Collective, whose hive-mind intelligence had evolved over millions of years, couldn't tolerate humanity's chaotic individualism. The Eternal Assembly, beings of pure energy who measured time in geological epochs, viewed human urgency and adaptability as dangerous instability. Each species had contributed to the growing sentiment that humanity needed to be contained. When the terrorist attacks on New Geneva had provided a convenient excuse, the Council had moved swiftly to remove what they saw as a disruptive element from their perfect galactic order. Admiral, incoming priority transmission. Lieutenant Rodriguez announced. It's Ambassador Thorne, broadcasting from the Council chambers. Sarah's heart sank. Ambassador Victoria Thorne had been humanity's chief representative to the Galactic Council for over a decade. A brilliant diplomat who had managed to maintain human influence despite growing anti-human sentiment. If Thorne was calling during the evacuation, it could only mean that the political situation had deteriorated further. The holographic display shifted to show Ambassador Thorne's familiar face, but her usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, her diplomatic composure replaced by barely controlled anger.
Admiral Chen, I'm broadcasting from what was formerly the Human Embassy.
Council security forces are giving me 10 minutes to gather personal effects before they seal the facility. Thorne's voice carried a bitterness that Sarah had never heard from the veteran diplomat. I need you to know that I've spent the last 3 months trying to prevent this exodus, presenting every argument, calling in every favor, appealing to species that we've saved from extinction. What was their response? Webb asked. The Vorthan representative actually laughed when I mentioned the Kepler colony rescue operation. He said that humanity's hero complex was exactly why we needed to be removed from civilized space. Thorne's hands shook slightly as she spoke. The Crystalline Collective claimed that human emotions were a psychic pollutant that interfered with their hive-mind communications. The Eternal Assembly declared that our short lifespans made us inherently reckless and untrustworthy. And the evidence of incoming threats? Sarah asked. I tried to present Dr. Vasquez's preliminary findings 3 days ago. The Council dismissed the data as human fearmongering and suggested that we were fabricating threats to justify our continued presence in their space. Thorne's expression grew darker. High Councillor Zenthar actually accused humanity of potentially collaborating with unknown entities to threaten Council security. The accusation was so absurd it would have been laughable under different circumstances. Humanity had spent 3 centuries bleeding and dying to protect Council worlds from every conceivable threat. Human soldiers had held the line against the devourer swarms. Human engineers had prevented the Cascade reactor incidents that could have sterilized entire systems. Human negotiators had prevented countless wars that could have torn the galaxy apart. Ma'am, Doctor, Vasquez interrupted, undetecting new activity from the entities. They're changing course, accelerating toward inhabited systems. Whatever signal they were waiting for, they seem to have received it. Sarah felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. In a few hours, the last human ships would leave Council space forever, taking with them the institutional knowledge and technological capabilities that had kept the galaxy stable for 3 centuries. Behind them, ancient horrors were stirring in the darkness, moving toward defenseless worlds whose inhabitants had convinced themselves they no longer needed protection. Admiral, Webb said quietly, what are your orders? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah could order the fleet to remain in Council space, to defend the ungrateful civilizations that had exiled them. Such an action would likely provoke the war that humanity had been trying to avoid, painting them as aggressors who refused to accept legitimate authority. Alternatively, she could honor the exile decree and lead humanity into the unknown regions beyond Council space, leaving billions of innocent beings to face cosmic horrors alone. It would mean abandoning every principle that had guided human expansion into the stars, but it would preserve humanity's future. Begin final evacuation procedures, she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of civilizations. All human personnel and assets are to be withdrawn from Council space as demanded. We will honor our agreement to the letter. And the incoming threat? Dr. Vasquez asked. Prepare a comprehensive data package containing all our research on the entities and transmit it to every major Council world. Mark it as a final gift from humanity to the galaxy. Sarah's voice hardened with resolve. After that, we focus on our own survival. As the transmission ended and the Prometheus began its final preparations for departure, Sarah returned to the observation deck. In the distance, she could see other human vessels executing their own withdrawals, carrying with them the accumulated expertise of 3 centuries among the stars. She thought about the Aegis defense grid, soon to fall silent without human operators to maintain it. She thought about the early warning networks that would gradually fail as their quantum processors decayed without proper maintenance. She thought about the thousands of small monitoring stations throughout Council space that would soon be nothing more than expensive debris. Most of all, she thought about the entities moving through the void between galaxies, vast intelligences that had waited patiently for exactly this moment. They had watched humanity's rise to prominence in Council space, had seen how human presence created stability and security across the galaxy. They had also seen the growing resentment that would eventually lead to humanity's exile. Now, with their greatest enemy removed from the board, they were finally ready to move. The galaxy had chosen to sever all ties with humanity, believing they could maintain peace and prosperity without their most troublesome allies. Within months, they would learn the true cost of that decision. The perfect galactic civilization that they had fought so hard to preserve was about to face its greatest test, without the one species that had consistently proven capable of meeting such challenges. As the last human transport cleared the sensor perimeter, Sarah whispered a prayer for the billions of souls who would soon face the darkness alone. They had made their choice, and humanity would respect it, even if it killed them all. 3 months after the human exodus, the first signs of collapse appeared in the Outer Rim territories. High Counselor Zenthar of the Vorthan Empire stood before the holographic display in the council chambers, his 4 arms gesticulating wildly as he tried to make sense of the reports flooding in from across the galaxy. The proud warrior race that had once commanded respect from 1,000 worlds was now reduced to desperate pleas for assistance that no longer existed. The Kepler Mining Consortium has completely collapsed, reported Sub-Counselor Vex, her crystalline form flickering with agitated light patterns. Without human engineering oversight, their quantum extraction systems have created 17 separate space-time anomalies. 3 entire asteroid fields have simply vanished from normal space. And the Andromeda trade routes? Asked Councillor Morthark of the Eternal Assembly, his energy form pulsing with ancient concern. Completely disrupted, Zenthar admitted through gritted teeth. Pirate fleets have overrun 6 major shipping lanes. The Rim colonies are reporting supply shortages that will reach critical levels within weeks. The irony was bitter enough to choke on. For decades, the Vorthan Empire had complained about human patrol fleets interfering with their territorial sovereignty. They had insisted that their own forces were perfectly capable of maintaining security in their regions. Now, without human coordination and technological support, their mighty fleets were scattered across too many fronts, unable to respond effectively to the chaos spreading through their space. What about the Shriek incursions? Asked Vex, her normally harmonious voice carrying discordant notes of fear. Xanthar's expression darkened further. The Shriekers were a nomadic species of cybernetic locusts that periodically swept through inhabited systems, consuming technology and leaving devastation in their wake. For over a century, human rapid response teams had contained these incursions before they could gain momentum, using specialized EMP weapons and tactical coordination that no other species had been able to replicate. 17 systems in the Beta Quadrant have gone dark, he admitted. Our fleets are moving to intercept, but without human tactical support, our response time has tripled. By the time our forces arrive, the Shriekers will have stripped those worlds bare and moved on. The silence that followed was deafening. Each council member was beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had done, but their pride prevented them from admitting the truth that was becoming increasingly obvious with each passing day. Dr. Elena Vasquez's warning about the entities in the void had been transmitted to every major council world 3 months ago. The data package had been comprehensive, detailing years of observations and analysis that painted a terrifying picture of an approaching threat unlike anything the galaxy had faced before. It had been dismissed as human propaganda, filed away and forgotten by bureaucrats who couldn't conceive of threats beyond their carefully ordered understanding of the universe. "Hi, Counselor," came a new voice over the communication array. "This is Defense Station Omega-7. We're detecting massive energy signatures approaching from the void sector." Xanthar's blood ran cold. Omega-7 was one of the outermost monitoring stations, positioned at the edge of Council space specifically to watch for threats from the intergalactic void. It was staffed by Vorthan warriors who had volunteered for what was essentially a suicide posting, knowing that anything dangerous enough to require early warning would likely destroy their station before help could arrive.
Can you identify the signatures? Xanthar asked, though he already suspected the answer.
Negative, sir. Whatever these things are, they're unlike anything in our databases. The energy readings are... High Counselor. These things are massive. Our instruments are detecting structures the size of small moons, moving in perfect formation at velocities that should be impossible for objects of that mass. Xanthar closed his eyes and tried to remember the details from the human data package that he had barely glanced at before dismissing it. The entities that the humans had been tracking were described as ancient intelligences from between galaxies, predators that viewed entire civilizations as prey. According to human projections, they should still be months away from inhabited systems. "What's their current trajectory and speed?" he asked. "They're moving directly toward the Kepler cluster, sir. At current velocity, they'll reach the outer colonies in... High Counselor, they'll be here in 6 days. 6 days." The humans had predicted months, but these entities had apparently accelerated their approach. Perhaps they sensed the weakness in the galaxy's defenses, or perhaps they had simply grown tired of waiting. Either way, the Council had less than a week to prepare for a threat that they barely understood and certainly couldn't handle alone. "Sound the general alarm," Xanthar ordered. "Deploy all available fleets to establish a defensive perimeter around the Kepler cluster. Contact all member worlds and begin immediate evacuation of non-essential personnel from the outer rim." "Sir, what about the Aegis defense grid?" asked the station commander. "The humans left the infrastructure intact, but none of our technicians have been able to activate it." Xanthar wanted to scream with frustration. The Aegis grid was humanity's greatest contribution to galactic security, a network of quantum sensors and automated defense platforms that could detect and respond to threats across vast distances. It had been designed specifically to counter the kind of entities now approaching their space, but it required human neural patterns to operate. The Council had demanded that humans leave it behind, assuming they could eventually reverse engineer the technology for their own use. 3 months of trying had produced nothing but burned-out circuits and frustrated engineers. The system was like a lock designed for a specific key, and they had banished the only beings capable of turning it. "Continue attempting to activate the grid," Xanthar said, knowing it was futile, and prepare a message for transmission to human space." The words felt like acid in his throat. For 3 centuries, the Vorthan Empire had prided itself on its military might and independence. They had been one of the primary forces behind the human exile, arguing that the galaxy would be stronger without humanity's chaotic influence. Now, faced with a threat that their proud fleets couldn't handle alone, they were reduced to begging for help from the species they had banished. "High Counselor," Vex interjected. "Surely you're not suggesting we contact the humans? After everything that's happened? I'm suggesting we do whatever it takes to prevent the extermination of every living being in this galaxy," Xanthar snapped. Pride is a luxury we can no longer afford. But even as he spoke, Zenthar knew it might already be too late. Human space was months away at best, and any message would take weeks to reach them, even using the fastest quantum communication networks. By the time humans could mount any kind of response, the entities would have already reached inhabited systems. Meanwhile, at the edge of the Kepler cluster, Captain Lin Zhao was experiencing her own crisis of conscience aboard the independent merchant vessel Star Dancer. As one of the few humans who had refused to honor the evacuation order, she had spent the last 3 months operating in the gray areas between Council space and the unknown regions, trading with settlements that couldn't afford to be picky about the species of their suppliers. "Captain, I'm picking up some weird readings on the deep space sensors," reported her navigation officer, a young Talarian refugee named Kex who had joined her crew after his homeworld was destroyed in a corporate war that human mediators might have prevented. "Define weird," Lin said, looking up from the cargo manifest she had been reviewing. The Star Dancer was carrying medical supplies to a mining colony that had been cut off from regular supply routes since the human exodus began. It was dangerous work, but someone had to fill the gaps that humanity's withdrawal had created. Multiple large objects approaching from the void sector, moving faster than anything should be able to move. The quantum signatures are... "Captain, these readings match some of the threat profiles in the old human defense databases." Lin felt her stomach drop. As a former officer in the Human Defense Force, she had access to classified information about the entities that lurked between galaxies. She had hoped never to see those particular signatures on her sensors, had prayed that the threats would remain safely distant until the galaxy found a way to prepare for them. "How long until they reach inhabited space?" she asked. "At current velocity, maybe 5 days," Kex reported. "Captain, what are these things?" Lin moved to the sensor station and studied the readings, her worst fears confirmed by the data scrolling across her screen. The entities were massive, easily dwarfing the largest known starships, and they moved with a coordination that suggested hive intelligence. According to human research, they were essentially living weapons, organisms that had evolved in the harsh environment between galaxies to consume the energy of stars and the life force of inhabited worlds. "They're exactly what the Council was warned about," she said grimly. "And without the Aegis defense grid, there's nothing to stop them." "Maybe we should run," suggested Kex. "Get as far away from here as possible." Lin considered the option. The Star Dancer was fast enough to outrun almost anything, and she had no obligation to risk her life for the civilizations that had exiled her people. But as she looked at the navigation display showing dozens of inhabited worlds in the entity's path, she found herself unable to turn away. "No," she said finally, "we're not running. Get me a quantum link to any human vessels still in the region. If these things are coming, we need to warn everyone we can." Over the next several hours, Lin managed to contact 17 other independent human ships, traders, and explorers who had chosen to remain in the frontier regions rather than return to human space. Together they formed an impromptu network of observers, tracking the entity's progress and broadcasting warnings to any inhabited system that would listen. Most of their warnings were ignored or dismissed as human propaganda, but a few colonial governors took the threat seriously enough to begin evacuation procedures. It wasn't much, but it might save thousands of lives when the entities finally arrived. Back in Council space, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The defensive fleet assembled around the Kepler cluster represented the largest military force the galaxy had seen since the last Great War, but even the most optimistic projections showed it would be insufficient to stop the approaching threat. The entity's energy signatures suggested weapons and defenses far beyond current galactic technology, and their numbers continued to grow as more contacts emerged from the void. "Hi, Counselor," reported Fleet Commander Thos, his usually steady voice betraying his concern. "Our tactical analysis is complete. These entities appear to be using some form of gravitational manipulation to achieve their impossible velocities. They're literally bending space-time around themselves to move faster than physics should allow. Can our weapons penetrate their defenses?" Zenthar asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Unknown, sir. Our most powerful plasma cannons might scratch their hulls, but we're talking about structures that appear to be comprised of materials we don't even have names for. It's like trying to fight a Star Destroyer with slingshots." The comparison was apt, but not comforting. For 3 centuries, Council fleets had been sufficient to handle any threat they encountered, from rebellious colonies to pirate fleets, to occasional incursions from hostile species. They had grown complacent, assuming that their advanced technology and numerical superiority would always be enough. They had never faced anything like the entities now bearing down on their worlds. "Sir?" came another voice over the communication array. "This is Dr. P." Yellen at the Kepler Research Station. I've been analyzing the entity's approach patterns, and I think I understand their targeting priorities. Explain. They're not moving randomly, High Counselor. They're following specific routes, targeting systems with high population densities and advanced technology. It's as if they're harvesting the most valuable worlds first, saving the less developed systems for later consumption. The implications were chilling. These entities weren't mindless destroyers. They were intelligent predators with a sophisticated understanding of galactic civilization. They had studied their prey, identified the most valuable targets, and planned their assault accordingly. Doctor, is there any pattern we can exploit, any weakness in their approach? I'm afraid not, sir. Their formation is perfect, their coordination flawless. Whoever or whatever is controlling them has planned this assault down to the smallest detail. The only variable they seem to have accounted for is, what, Doctor? Speak freely. The absence of human defensive capability, sir. Every target they're approaching was previously defended by human-operated systems or patrol routes. It's as if they know exactly which defenses have been removed. The silence that followed was deafening. The entities hadn't just been waiting for humanity to be exiled. They had been studying human defensive strategies for decades, learning exactly which systems they needed to neutralize to clear the path for their invasion. The Council had done their work for them, removing the one species capable of mounting an effective defense against threats from beyond the galaxy. In their arrogance and xenophobia, they had handed the entities exactly what they needed to succeed. As reports continued to pour in from across the galaxy, painting an increasingly desperate picture of collapsing trade routes, failed defensive systems, and approaching cosmic horror, one truth became undeniably clear. The galaxy's perfect civilization was dying, and the only species that might have been able to save it was now light years away, nursing wounds inflicted by the very beings they had spent centuries protecting. The severing was complete, and the consequences were already beyond anything the Council had imagined possible. Admiral Sarah Chen received the first distress signal while the human fleet was establishing their new base of operations in the Outer Spiral, a region of space so remote that most galactic maps simply labeled it unexplored territory. The message came through quantum channels that shouldn't have been able to reach this far from Council space, suggesting that whoever sent it had access to technology that rivaled humanity's most advanced systems. Admiral, you need to hear this. Dr.
Elena Vasquez said, her face pale as she forwarded the transmission to the command center of their newly constructed orbital platform.
The past 3 months have been spent building humanity's new home from scratch, converting asteroid fields into habitable stations and establishing the infrastructure needed to support a civilization in exile.
The voice that emerged from the speakers belonged to High Counselor Zentha, but it bore little resemblance to the arrogant warrior who had helped orchestrate humanity's exile. Instead, it carried the hollow tone of a being who had seen his world crumble around him. To any human vessels receiving this transmission, this is High Counselor Zenthar of the Vorthan Empire. Council space is under assault by entities matching the descriptions in your data package from 3 months ago. Our fleets are gone. The Kepler cluster has fallen. 17 billion souls lost in 6 hours. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. 17 billion dead in 6 hours meant that the entities were even more devastating than human projections had suggested. The Kepler cluster had been home to some of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, protected by defensive fleets that could have held off conventional invasions for years. The entities are moving toward the core worlds, Zenthar's message continued. Our weapons are useless against them. They consume energy itself, growing stronger with each system they devour. We formally request immediate assistance from humanity under the Emergency Mutual Defense Accords. The irony was staggering. The Emergency Mutual Defense Accords were treaties that humanity had proposed decades ago, formal agreements that would obligate all Council members to assist each other against existential threats. The Council had rejected these proposals, claiming that humanity was trying to create pretexts for military intervention in their affairs. Now, with cosmic predators literally consuming their worlds, they were invoking accords that didn't exist to request help from the species they had banished. There's more, Admiral, Dr. Vasquez said, advancing the transmission. We have attempted to activate the Aegis defense grid, but our technicians cannot interface with the quantum processors. The system requires human neural patterns to function, and we no longer have access to human operators. Zenthar's voice broke slightly, the proud warrior finally acknowledging the magnitude of the Council's miscalculation. If there is any possibility of reconciliation, any chance that humanity might consider returning to aid in our defense, we are prepared to discuss terms. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to process the implications. The entities that humanity had been tracking for months had finally reached inhabited space, and they were devastating everything in their path. The Council's mighty fleets, their advanced technology, their ancient wisdom, none of it meant anything against predators that existed on a completely different scale of power. "What's the current status of our deep space monitoring array?" she asked. "Still functional, Admiral," reported Commander Torres from the sensor station. "We've been tracking the entity's progress since they entered Council space. The destruction is comprehensive. They're not just destroying inhabited worlds, they're harvesting them, stripping away everything from the planet's core to its atmospheric envelope." Sarah pulled up the tactical display, watching red icons spread across the holographic representation of Council space like a plague. Each icon represented a system that had gone dark, billions of lives extinguished in hours as the entities consumed everything capable of supporting civilization. "How long before they reached the core worlds?" she asked. "At current rate of advance, approximately 4 weeks," Torres replied. "But, Admiral, there's something else. Our long-range sensors are detecting additional entities emerging from the void. What we're seeing now isn't the full invasion force, it's just the advanced scouts." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. If these devastating entities were merely the beginning, then the galaxy was facing an extinction-level event that went far beyond anything they had prepared for. The species that had exiled humanity weren't just facing defeat, they were facing complete annihilation. "Admiral," came a new voice over the communication array, "this is Captain Lin Zhao aboard the merchant vessel Star Dancer. I'm currently in the Rim territories, coordinating evacuation efforts with other independent human ships." Sarah remembered Zhao from her service record, a former Defense Force officer who had resigned in protest when humanity agreed to the evacuation terms. She was one of dozens of humans who had chosen to remain in the frontier regions rather than return to human space, operating in the gray areas between Council territory and the unknown regions.
Captain Zhao, what's your current status? Grim, Admiral.
"I've got 17 ships working to evacuate civilian populations from the outer colonies, but we can barely make a dent in the numbers. Millions of beings are trapped on worlds directly in the entity's path, and the Council fleets have completely withdrawn to defend the core worlds." Sarah felt anger building in her chest. Even facing extinction, the Council was prioritizing the wealthy, advanced worlds at the center of their civilization, abandoning the frontier colonies that had always been treated as expendable. It was exactly the kind of callous calculation that had led to humanity's exile in the first place. "How many people can you evacuate with current resources?" she asked. "Maybe a few 100,000 if we push our ships beyond safe capacity," Zhao replied. "It's not nearly enough, but it's all we can do with what we have." Sarah looked around the command center at her senior staff, seeing her own conflict reflected in their faces. Every instinct they possessed as human beings demanded that they respond to the crisis, that they rush back to Council space to do whatever they could to save innocent lives. But they also had a responsibility to their own species, to the millions of humans who were depending on them to build a new future in the remote regions where they had taken refuge. "Admiral, Dr. Vasquez said quietly, "I've been analyzing the entity's behavior patterns, and I think I understand why they attacked now." "Explain." "They're not just predators, they're hunters. They study their prey, learning about defensive capabilities and social structures before they strike. The timing of their invasion wasn't coincidental, it was calculated. They waited until humanity was removed from the equation because we were the only species they considered a genuine threat." The realization was both flattering and terrifying. Across vast distances and eons of time, cosmic predators had identified humanity as the primary obstacle to their plans. Not the ancient eternal assembly with their energy-based technology. Not the crystalline collective with their hive mind intelligence. Not the Vorthan Empire with their massive fleets. Humanity, the species that had been in space for less than 5 centuries, was the one they had waited to eliminate before beginning their assault. "What made us special?" Sarah asked. "Adaptability," Dr. Vasquez replied immediately. "Every other species in the galaxy developed along predictable lines, following evolutionary and technological paths that the entities could analyze and counter. But humans, we're chaotic, unpredictable. We develop solutions that don't follow logical patterns. We adapt faster than our opponents can adjust to our adaptations." Sarah remembered dozens of examples from her own career. Human engineers finding creative solutions to problems that had stumped alien scientists for centuries. Human diplomats forging alliances between species that had been enemies for millennia. Human tacticians developing strategies that worked specifically because they violated conventional military doctrine. It was that same chaotic adaptability that had made other species uncomfortable with humanity's growing influence. They preferred the ordered, predictable interactions of their ancient civilizations, where everyone knew their place and followed established protocols. Human unpredictability had been seen as a bug in the system rather than the feature that might have saved them all. Admiral, incoming transmission from Earth Command, Lieutenant Rodriguez announced. Fleet Admiral Webb's image appeared on the holographic display, but his usual composure had been replaced by barely controlled urgency. Behind him, Sarah could see the bustling activity of a command center preparing for crisis operations. Sarah, we've been monitoring the situation in Council space through our long-range sensors. The destruction is beyond anything we projected, and it's accelerating. We estimate that the entities will consume the entire galaxy within 6 months unless something stops them. What are your orders, sir? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. We can't stand by and watch entire civilizations be exterminated, regardless of how they've treated us. I'm authorizing Operation Lighthouse. Immediate deployment of all available human fleets to establish evacuation corridors and defensive positions around inhabited systems. Operation Lighthouse was humanity's contingency plan for exactly this scenario. A massive humanitarian mission that would prioritize saving as many lives as possible while gathering intelligence about the entity's capabilities and weaknesses. It was also an incredibly dangerous operation that would put human forces directly in the path of cosmic predators.
Admiral, with respect, we don't have authorization to enter Council space, Sarah pointed out.
If we deploy fleets without permission, they could interpret it as an invasion and attack us along with the entities. The Council sent a formal request for assistance 30 minutes ago, Webb replied grimly. They're offering full reinstatement of human territorial rights, technological exchange agreements, and permanent seats on the High Council in exchange for our immediate intervention. Sarah felt a bitter laugh building in her throat. 3 months ago, the Council had been willing to risk war rather than tolerate humanity's continued presence in their space. Now, facing extinction, they were offering everything they had once refused to give, desperately hoping that the species they had banished would be willing to die for them. What are the terms of engagement, she asked. Full operational autonomy, access to all Council databases and facilities, and complete authority over joint military operations. They're essentially giving us carte blanche to do whatever we think is necessary to stop these entities. It was everything that humanity had requested during their 3 centuries of service to galactic civilization, offered at the moment when it might already be too late to matter. But Sarah also knew that her people would never be able to live with themselves if they let billions of innocent beings die when they might have been able to prevent it. Timeframe for deployment, she asked. All available fleets are to begin immediate transit to Council space. Initial waves should arrive in the affected regions within 72 hours. Sarah looked around the command center one more time, studying the faces of the officers who would be leading humanity back into the war zone they had been forced to abandon. They were tired, angry, and justifiably bitter about the treatment they had received, but she could see the determination in their eyes. Despite everything that had happened, they were still human, and humans didn't abandon innocent people to cosmic horrors. Admiral Webb, the Prometheus battle group will begin transit within the hour, she said formally. We'll establish forward operations in the Kepler system and begin evacuation operations immediately. Admiral, Dr. Vasquez interjected, there's something else you need to know. The entities aren't just consuming inhabited worlds, they're corrupting them. Planets that have been harvested are becoming staging areas for additional invasion forces. Every system they take makes them stronger and gives them more resources to continue their expansion. How long before the corruption spreads beyond Council space? Sarah asked. At current rate, maybe 3 months before it reaches the outer spiral. Maybe 6 months before it threatens human space. The timeline was both sobering and motivating. Even if humanity chose to ignore the Council's plight, they would eventually have to face these entities anyway. Better to confront them now, while Council forces could still provide support, than wait for them to grow even stronger by consuming the entire galaxy.
All ships, Sarah announced over the fleet communication network. Prepare for immediate departure.
We're going home. But even as the human fleets began their journey back to Council space, Sarah knew that they were returning to a galaxy fundamentally changed from the one they had been forced to leave. The entities had shattered the illusion of safety that had allowed the Council's civilization to flourish, revealing the universe to be far more dangerous and hostile than anyone had imagined. The question now was whether humanity's chaotic adaptability would be enough to find a solution to a threat that had evolved specifically to counter every advantage the galaxy's civilizations possessed. The entities had planned this invasion for eons, studying their prey and preparing counters for every possible defense. But they had made one critical miscalculation. In their analysis of galactic civilization, they had assumed that humanity's exile would be permanent, that pride and resentment would prevent reconciliation, even in the face of extinction. They had underestimated the one trait that truly defined humanity above all others, their willingness to forgive their enemies and die for strangers, even when those strangers had betrayed them. It was that willingness that would either save the galaxy or ensure that humanity died alongside the civilizations that had cast them out. The first human ships arrived in Council space to find chaos beyond imagination. Where the proud Kepler cluster had once housed 17 billion beings across 43 worlds, there was now only a twisted monument to cosmic horror. The planets remained, but they had been fundamentally altered, their surfaces writhing with biomechanical structures that pulsed with alien life. Admiral Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the UES Prometheus, studying the sensor readings that defied every law of physics she understood. The entities hadn't simply destroyed the Kepler worlds, they had transformed them into something that hurt to look at directly, as if the very act of observation was somehow dangerous to human consciousness. "Admiral, I'm reading massive energy signatures from the planet's surfaces," reported Commander Torres, his voice tight with controlled fear. "It's like the worlds themselves have become weapons, generating power outputs that rival our largest fusion reactors." "Any signs of survivors?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Negative, ma'am. But the energy pattern suggests that the biomass from the original inhabitants has been incorporated into whatever these structures are. The entities didn't just kill everyone, they absorbed them into their expansion infrastructure." Sarah felt her stomach turn. The implications were horrifying beyond words. The entities weren't just predators, they were transformation engines, converting everything they encountered into resources for their continued expansion. Every planet they consumed became a factory for producing more of themselves. Every population they harvested became raw material for their growth. "Admiral, incoming transmission from the rescue flotilla," announced Lieutenant Rodriguez. The holographic display flickered to life, showing Captain Lin Zhao's face streaked with exhaustion and something that might have been despair. Behind her, Sarah could see the cramped interior of a transport ship packed far beyond its safe capacity with refugees from the outer colonies. "Admiral Chen, thank God you're here," Zhao said, her usual composure cracking slightly. "We've managed to evacuate about 2 million people from the affected systems, but the entities are moving faster than we projected. They're not just following predictable routes anymore, they're actively hunting fleeing civilian populations." "Explain." 3 hours ago, we detected entity scouts pursuing a refugee convoy from the Tau Ceti system. They followed the ships through 6 different hyperspace jumps, never losing contact despite every evasion technique we tried. When the convoy finally stopped to refuel, the entities arrived within minutes and consumed the entire fleet. Sarah absorbed this information with growing alarm. If the entities were actively hunting refugees rather than simply consuming worlds in their path, it suggested a level of tactical awareness that went far beyond simple predation. They were systematically eliminating any possible survivors, ensuring that no one escaped to warn other systems or organize resistance. "Captain, what's the status on the Aegis defense grid?" "Still non-functional," Zhao replied. "We've got teams of human technicians working around the clock to reactivate the system, but the quantum processors were sabotaged before our evacuation. Someone deliberately corrupted the neural interface protocols to prevent reactivation." The betrayal cut deep, though Sarah shouldn't have been surprised. Even as the Council begged for human assistance, some faction within their government had apparently decided to ensure that humanity could never again possess the tools needed to defend galactic civilization. They had crippled their own defenses rather than allow humans to control them. "How long to repair the damage?" she asked. "Dr. Vasquez estimates at least 2 weeks to rebuild the interface protocols from scratch, assuming we can protect the technicians while they work. But Admiral, we may not have 2 weeks. The entities are accelerating their advance, and our conventional weapons are essentially useless against them." Sarah turned to study the tactical display showing the current position of entity forces throughout Council space. Red zones marked systems that had been completely consumed. Yellow zones indicated worlds under active assault, and the shrinking blue zones represented the dwindling safe areas where Council fleets were attempting to establish defensive positions. "What about the Council forces?" she asked. "Are they coordinating with our operations?" "That's complicated," Zhao replied carefully. High Counselor Zenthar has given us full operational authority, but many of the sector commanders are still treating us as occupying forces rather than allies. The 4th and 3rd Fleet actually fired warning shots at our evacuation ships yesterday, claiming we were violating their territorial sovereignty. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to contain her frustration. Even facing extinction, some members of the Council couldn't overcome their resentment of humanity's capabilities. They would rather maintain their pride and die with honor than accept help from the species they had banished. Admiral Dr. Vasquez's voice came over the communication array. I've completed my analysis of the entity behavior patterns, and I've identified their primary weakness. For the first time in days, Sarah felt a spark of hope.
What did you find?
The entities are incredibly efficient, but that efficiency is also their limitation. They follow optimal strategies based on mathematical calculations, always choosing the most effective approach to achieving their goals. But that means they have trouble adapting to truly irrational decisions. Sarah frowned. How does that help us? Our conventional tactics are already proving ineffective against them. Not conventional tactics, Admiral. Completely illogical tactics. Remember what made humanity dangerous to them in the first place. Our unpredictability, our willingness to make decisions that don't follow optimal strategic doctrine. If we can develop strategies that are actively counterproductive by normal military standards, we might be able to create situations that the entities can't properly respond to. It was a brilliant insight, but also a terrifying one. Dr. Vasquez was essentially suggesting that humanity's best chance of victory lay in abandoning everything they had learned about effective military strategy and instead embracing chaos as a weapon.
What did you have in mind? Sarah asked.
Phase 1 would involve deliberately exposing our forces to entity attacks while broadcasting false strategic intelligence designed to confuse their tactical analysis. Phase 2 would be simultaneous assaults on targets that provide no strategic value but maximum psychological impact. Phase 3, yes. Phase 3 involves something that no rational military commander would ever consider. We deliberately allow the entities to capture and convert human worlds, then use their own transformation process against them. The suggestion was so audacious that Sarah's first instinct was to reject it immediately. Dr. Vasquez was proposing that they sacrifice human colonies to the entities, allowing cosmic horrors to transform their people into biomechanical weapons, all in the hope that some aspect of human unpredictability might survive the conversion process. But as she studied the tactical display showing the relentless advance of entity forces, Sarah realized that conventional strategies had already failed. The Council's mighty fleets had been swept aside like children's toys, their advanced technology proving useless against opponents who existed on a completely different scale of power. Perhaps the only way to defeat an enemy that had planned for every rational response was to give them an irrational one. How long would you need to develop detailed tactical plans? She asked. 12 hours for preliminary strategies, Admiral. But I need to emphasize that this approach carries enormous risks. We'll be gambling with the lives of entire human colonies. And there's no guarantee that our chaos tactics will be effective. Noted. Doctor, begin developing your plans immediately. As the transmission ended, Sarah found herself staring at the distorted images of the consumed Kepler worlds, trying to imagine what it must have been like for the billions of beings who had watched cosmic predators descend from the void to transform their homes into alien factories. Admiral, Commander Torres said quietly. Incoming priority transmission from High Counselor Zenthar. The Vorthan leader appeared on the holographic display, but his proud bearing had been replaced by obvious desperation. Behind him, Sarah could see the frantic activity of a command center under siege, with officers rushing between stations and damage reports scrolling across multiple screens. Admiral Chen, the entities have broken through our defensive perimeters around the Vega system. We estimate total planetary consumption within 18 hours unless immediate intervention is possible. Sarah checked the tactical display. The Vega system housed over 3 billion inhabitants across 7 worlds, including some of the galaxy's most important cultural and educational centers. Its loss would be a blow to galactic civilization that went far beyond mere strategic considerations. What forces do you have available for defense? She asked. The 7th and 9th battle groups, approximately 400 vessels total. But Admiral, our weapons have proven completely ineffective against entity defensive systems. We need human technological support if there's any hope of stopping them. The request was reasonable, but Sarah knew that throwing conventional forces against the entities would only result in more deaths without achieving any meaningful objectives. If Dr. Vasquez's analysis was correct, Their only chance lay in tactics that violated every principle of sound military doctrine. High Counselor, I'm ordering the immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel from the Vega system. Any ships available for transport duty should begin rescue operations immediately. Admiral, surely you're not suggesting we abandon 3 billion people without a fight? I'm suggesting we fight smart rather than dying gloriously, Sarah replied. My tactical staff has identified potential weaknesses in entity strategic behavior, but exploiting those weaknesses will require approaches that your commanders may find unorthodox. Zenthar's expression grew troubled. What kind of unorthodox approaches? Sarah hesitated, knowing that what she was about to propose would sound like madness to a conventional military mind. But the conventional approach had already failed spectacularly, leaving billions dead and entire star systems transformed into alien weapons. We're going to give the entities exactly what they want, she said finally. We're going to let them capture human colonies, harvest human populations, and incorporate our technology into their expansion infrastructure. And then we're going to teach them why humanity was the one species they should have eliminated completely before beginning this invasion. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Zenthar, desperate as he was for any hope of victory, seemed stunned by the audacity of what Sarah was proposing. Admiral, he said carefully, are you suggesting that you intend to sacrifice human lives as part of some larger strategy? I'm suggesting that we've already lost the conventional war, High Counselor. The entities planned this invasion for eons, developing counters for every predictable strategy that galactic civilization might employ. Our only advantage is the one trait they couldn't plan for, our willingness to do things that make no rational sense. Sarah could see the conflict playing out across Zenthar's features. Part of him was horrified by the implications of her strategy, but another part recognized that conventional approaches had already proven futile. The galaxy was dying, and sometimes desperate situations required desperate measures. What do you need from us? He asked finally. Complete operational autonomy and access to all Council databases. My teams need to understand exactly how the entities are conducting their transformation process, and we need detailed intelligence on their expansion patterns. Done. What else? Sarah looked around the bridge at her senior officers, seeing her own grim determination reflected in their faces. They were about to embark on a strategy that would either save the galaxy or ensure that humanity died alongside the civilizations that had cast them out. We need volunteers, she said quietly. People willing to be captured by the entities, to undergo their transformation process and remain conscious long enough to introduce chaos into their systems from within. It was perhaps the most horrible request that any military commander had ever made of their personnel. She was asking for volunteers to sacrifice their humanity itself, to allow cosmic horrors to transform them into weapons, while gambling that some spark of human consciousness might survive the process. But as she looked around the bridge, Sarah saw hands rising slowly, officers stepping forward with quiet determination. They understood the stakes, understood that conventional victory was impossible, understood that sometimes the only way to win was to sacrifice everything that made victory worthwhile. Admiral, Lieutenant Rodriguez said quietly, when do we begin? Sarah turned back to the tactical display, watching the red zone spread across the galaxy like a plague. Somewhere in that chaos, billions of innocent beings were dying while their governments desperately tried to maintain the illusion that conventional strategies might still prevail. Immediately, she said, send the signal to all human fleets. Operation Chaos is now in effect. We're going to teach these entities why humanity was the one species they should have feared above all others. The war for the galaxy's survival was about to enter its most dangerous phase, and humanity was preparing to employ weapons that no sane civilization would ever consider using. But sanity was a luxury they could no longer afford, and the entities were about to learn that their careful calculations had missed the most important variable of all, the willingness of humans to embrace madness as the ultimate act of defiance against impossible odds. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Reed knew he was going to die. What he didn't know was whether anything recognizably human would survive the process. He stood in the cargo bay of the transport ship Defiance, surrounded by 43 other volunteers who had agreed to participate in the most insane military operation in galactic history. Each of them carried experimental neural implants designed by Dr. Vasquez's team, devices that might preserve some fragment of human consciousness during the entity transformation process. Remember, Dr. Vasquez said over the communication array, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion, the implants will only protect your core personality engrams for approximately 72 hours after transformation. After that, the entity conversion process will likely overwhelm any remaining human neural patterns. Reed touched the small device behind his right ear, feeling the slight warmth it generated as it interfaced with his brain's electrical activity. According to the technical specifications, it was humanity's best attempt at preserving consciousness during cosmic horror transformation, which was possibly the most ridiculous sentence ever written in a military manual. "Sir," came the voice of Ensign Carter, barely out of the academy and looking terrified despite her obvious determination. "What exactly are we supposed to do once we're changed?" "Cause chaos," Reed replied simply. "The entities function through perfect coordination and optimal efficiency. Our job is to introduce variables that their collective intelligence can't process effectively. Think of it as psychological warfare taken to its logical extreme." What Reed didn't mention was that none of them really knew what would happen once the transformation began. Human understanding of entity biology was limited to external observations and theoretical projections. They were essentially volunteering for a first contact scenario with cosmic predators, hoping that human unpredictability would somehow survive a process designed to erase individual consciousness entirely. "Incoming transmission from Admiral Chen," announced the pilot over the internal communication system. Admiral Sarah Chen's image appeared on the cargo bay's holographic display, her expression carrying the weight of impossible decisions and desperate gambles. "Team Alpha, you are approaching the designated insertion point above the entity-controlled world formerly known as Kepler Prime. Intelligence indicates that the planetary transformation process is approximately 60% complete, with active entity infrastructure covering most of the southern continent." Reed studied the tactical display showing their target, trying not to think about the fact that 3 days ago, Kepler Prime had been home to over 2 billion sentient beings. Now, it was a writhing mass of biomechanical structures that pulsed with alien purpose. A factory for producing more entity forces to continue their galactic conquest. "Your mission remains the same," Admiral Chen continued. "Allow yourselves to be captured and processed by entity transformation systems. Once converted, attempt to introduce chaotic variables into their operational network. Remember, you are not expected to survive this mission, but your sacrifice may provide the intelligence we need to develop effective countermeasures." It was a brutally honest assessment of their chances, but Reed appreciated the straightforward approach. They were volunteers for a suicide mission, with the slight possibility that their deaths might serve some larger purpose in humanity's desperate struggle for survival. "Admiral," Reed said, stepping forward to address the holographic projection, "what's the status on the Aegis defense grid?" "Still offline, Commander. Dr. Vasquez's teams have managed to restore basic functionality to 17% of the network, but the quantum processes require constant human oversight to prevent cascade failures. We simply don't have enough technicians to maintain full grid operations while conducting rescue operations across 47 systems." Reed nodded grimly. The Aegis grid had been humanity's greatest contribution to galactic security, but it was also incredibly complex, requiring the kind of intuitive understanding that only human engineers seem to possess. Without full human staffing, it would remain a powerful tool that no one could effectively operate. "Sir, approaching drop zone," reported the pilot. "Entity patrols are moving to intercept. I'm reading massive energy signatures from the planetary surface." "Understood," Reed replied. "All teams prepare for deployment." As Reed strapped himself into the drop pod that would carry him to the surface of the corrupted world below, he thought about the irony of their situation. 3 months ago, the Galactic Council had exiled humanity because they considered human behavior too chaotic and unpredictable for civilized space. Now, that same chaos was their only hope of defeating enemies who had planned for every rational response. "Commander," Ensign Carter said over the communication network, "I want you to know that it's been an honor serving under your command." "The honor has been mine, Ensign," Reed replied. "Remember your training, trust your instincts, and if you get the chance to mess with alien psychology, make it count." The drop pods launched in sequence, tiny projectiles hurling themselves toward a world that no longer resembled anything natural. Through the reinforced viewport, Reed could see the twisted landscape of Kepler Prime spreading out below, biomechanical structures that defied description covering what had once been cities and forests. As his pod approached the surface, Reed watched entity forces converging on the landing sites, massive creatures that seemed to be composed of living machinery and organic tissue in equal measure. They moved with perfect coordination, responding to threats with mathematical precision that suggested hive mind intelligence. The first transformation began within minutes of landing. Reed felt the entity tendrils penetrating his environmental suit, injecting some kind of biological agent that immediately began rewriting his cellular structure. The pain was indescribable, as if every nerve in his body was being individually dismantled and rebuilt according to alien specifications. But through the agony, he could feel the neural implant activating, creating a small sanctuary of human consciousness within the storm of transformation. It was like having a tiny piece of earth inside his skull, a core of chaotic humanity that the entity process couldn't quite eliminate. As the transformation progressed, Reed began to understand how the entities functioned. They operated through collective intelligence networks that shared information instantaneously across vast distances, allowing perfect coordination between individual units. Each converted being became a node in this network, contributing their unique capabilities to the collective while losing all individual identity. But Reed's implant was creating interference in the network, introducing random variables that the collective intelligence couldn't properly process. Where other converted beings thought in perfect harmony, Reed's thoughts remained stubbornly human, filled with contradictions and irrational decisions that created static in the entity communication system. This is working, he realized with amazement. They can't filter out the human elements. Through the entity network, Reed could sense his fellow volunteers undergoing similar transformations throughout the corrupted world. Each of them was introducing their own brand of chaos into the system, creating pockets of unpredictability that the collective intelligence struggled to accommodate. But more importantly, Reed was gaining access to information that no human had ever possessed. Through the network, he could see the entity's long-term plans, their assessment of galactic civilization's weaknesses, their strategies for expanding beyond this galaxy to consume other spiral arms. The scope of their ambitions was terrifying. This invasion wasn't the end goal, it was merely the first step in a campaign that spanned multiple galaxies and geological epochs. The entities viewed entire civilizations as temporary obstacles to be absorbed and converted, adding their unique capabilities to an ever-growing collective that had been expanding across the universe for eons. But Reed also sensed something else through the network. Confusion and growing alarm as the entity collective struggled to process the chaotic variables that the human volunteers were introducing. Their perfect efficiency was being disrupted by beings who insisted on making irrational decisions even after conversion. Time to really mess with their heads, Reed thought. Using his access to the entity network, Reed began broadcasting false operational data to other nodes in the system. He reported successful conversions of worlds that hadn't been attacked yet, created phantom human fleets in sectors that were actually empty, and generated tactical assessments that painted humanity as simultaneously weaker and stronger than they actually were. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Entity forces began responding to threats that didn't exist, moving fleets to defend against attacks that were never coming, allocating resources to counter strategies that humanity wasn't actually employing. Through the network, Reed could sense similar disruption being caused by his fellow volunteers across the corrupted world. Each of them was using their unique perspective to introduce chaos into different aspects of entity operations, creating a growing cascade of confusion and inefficiency. Meanwhile, in the clean spaces between stars, Admiral Sarah Chen watched the tactical displays with growing amazement as entity forces began making inexplicably poor decisions across multiple sectors. Admiral, we're detecting massive entity fleet movements toward the Procyon system, reported Commander Torres. But our intelligence indicates that Procyon was evacuated 2 weeks ago. There's nothing there for them to attack.
And the Vega defense operation? Sarah asked. The entity forces that were overwhelming our positions have suddenly withdrawn, apparently responding to some kind of priority alert from their command network.
Our defensive lines are holding for the first time since the invasion began. Doctor, Vasquez appeared on the holographic display, her face flushed with excitement and exhaustion. Admiral, we're detecting massive disruptions in entity communication patterns. It's as if their collective intelligence is experiencing the equivalent of a nervous breakdown. Coordination between individual units is breaking down, and their strategic decision-making appears to be compromised. Sarah felt her heart racing with the first hope she had experienced since the invasion began. How long can this disruption be maintained? Unknown, Admiral. The volunteers' neural implants will eventually be overwhelmed by the conversion process, but the chaos they're introducing appears to be creating a cascade effect. The entity collective is spending enormous resources trying to filter out the corrupted data, which is reducing their overall operational efficiency. On the surface of Kepler Prime, Reed felt his humanity slipping away bit by bit as the entity transformation process continued its relentless work. But even as his individual identity dissolved, he continued broadcasting chaotic variables into the network, using his final moments of human consciousness to create as much disruption as possible. Remember, he thought to himself as the implant's power began to fade, We were the species they should have eliminated first. Now they get to learn why. Across the galaxy, the effects of Operation Chaos rippled through entity-controlled space like a virus of unpredictability. Fleet movements became erratic, resource allocation grew inefficient, and the perfect coordination that had made the entities unstoppable began to break down under the weight of too much contradictory information. The volunteers were dying, their humanity consumed by cosmic horrors that had never encountered prey willing to sacrifice their very consciousness as a weapon. But their sacrifice was buying time for the rest of the galaxy, creating opportunities for evacuation and defense that hadn't existed since the invasion began.
Admiral, Dr. Vasquez reported 12 hours later, I'm detecting widespread system failures in entity-controlled regions.
Whatever our people did down there, it's working. The collective intelligence appears to be fragmenting, with individual units beginning to act independently, rather than as part of a coordinated whole.
Sarah allowed herself a moment of fierce pride in the volunteers who had given everything to achieve this impossible victory. They had proven that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their fleets, but their willingness to embrace irrationality as the ultimate weapon against order.
But even as entity forces struggled with the chaos virus spreading through their networks, Sarah knew this was only the beginning. The entities were adapting, learning to filter out the corrupted data, developing new protocols to maintain collective unity.
What's the status on Aegis grid restoration, she asked.
67% functionality achieved, Admiral. With the entity forces disrupted, our technician teams have been able to work without constant interruption. Full grid activation should be possible within 18 hours. Sarah nodded. The chaos tactics had bought them the time they needed to restore humanity's defensive capabilities. But the real war was just beginning. The entities would eventually overcome the disruption and adapt their strategies to counter human unpredictability. But they had made one crucial mistake in their eons of planning. They had underestimated humanity's capacity for innovation under pressure, their ability to develop new solutions when old approaches failed. The galaxy that the entities had expected to find after humanity's exile no longer existed. In its place was something unprecedented in cosmic history, a truly united galactic civilization, bonded together by shared crisis and a grudging respect for the chaotic species that had saved them all. As reports continued to pour in from across the galaxy, describing entity retreats and defensive victories that should have been impossible, Sarah felt a grim smile spreading across her face. The entities had severed humanity's ties to galactic civilization, believing it would leave the galaxy defenseless. Instead, they had created the one thing capable of defeating them, a galaxy where every species understood that sometimes the only rational response to impossible odds was to embrace beautiful, chaotic, magnificently human irrationality. The war was far from over, but for the first time since the invasion began, the galaxy had hope, and that hope had a distinctly human flavor to it.